church a lot, even at work. Even when I'm working and I'm teaching algebra, I'm thinking about our church. I don't know what the connection is, but it's just, I can't get the church out of it because it's just, being a pastor is not something that you do, just kind of who you are, whether you like it or not. And it's kind of funny because, I talk to our pastoral staff, in our meetings and stuff like that, and every once in a while they bring up the fact that I should do full-time ministry. I don't know what drugs they're taking to make them think that. But we're having this conversation with Mark and Pastor Sam and I think we're going to a movie or something like that. And he was saying, the whole full-time ministry thing kind of came up, and I said something, I'll never do full, I'll get swallowed by a fish first. And then Sam just turned around, looked at me with all seriousness, and he said, well, I'm going to pray that you get swallowed by a fish. So I didn't go to the beach for 2 weeks after that. And I did go swimming in our pool, but I figured if I get swallowed by a fish in our pool, then I got nothing to say. So it's kind of interesting. But it is who I am, even though I'm kind of reluctant to do that right now. And I think about our church a lot because I think about our identity as a church and how that affects the way that you form your identity, because that's the way that we're created, whether you realize it or not, that the way that you live your life, the things that you do and things like that come as a result of who you are. So that's why a lot of you will say, why do you do the things that you do? That's who I am. And that seems to be the answer that people give. Now, part of that is very biblical because God has created you to do that. And when I hear people say that, I get really excited because, man, if you only knew, if you could only acknowledge that God's fingerprint is on you, that I know that God exists by what you just said, that God has placed within you a desire to be consistent, your actions to be consistent with who you are. But the issue is not that. The issue is, where do you get your identity? And where do those actions come from? And where is those actions the proper place of your identity? And that's my primary concern as a pastor in this church. And one thing that I think about a lot, too, is Jesus' call to discipleship and how our church identity reflects what Jesus is saying, too. Because Jesus is saying, in order to be my disciple, you need to deny yourself, take up your cross daily, and follow me. Because if you can't do that, then you can't be my disciple. And that's, I can't sanitize that. I can't water that down. Because if I did, it wouldn't be something that he says. And ultimately what he's saying is this. He's saying, if I were to translate that phrase into our vernacular in the way that we speak to each other now, he's saying, you could only be my disciple if you deny yourself every single day, follow me, and carry a gas chamber with you all the time, knowing that you are dead to yourself. And if you can't do that, you can't be my disciple. And that's crazy. It's scary when I think about that. I think about, does my life reflect that? Because when I think of the cross, I think about, back in history, during Jesus' time, the cross is something that was despicable. It's not something that people talked about at the dinner table. It's kind of like when you're eating, meat or something, you don't talk about poo. It's just inappropriate, right? But you don't talk about the cross at dinner time because it was not good manners to do that. And in fact, parents would scare their kids by saying, we're going to crucify you like we crucify those other people, to keep their kids in line in those days. And what they did back then was they would have crosses out on the roads and stuff like that. They would have crucified people on the roads, and they would light them up at night. So you have lit people up at night and crucified and use them as street lights pretty much. Back in the day. And cities had walls back then too. They would put crucified people on the outside of the walls to warn you that if you mess around in our city, that's what's going to happen to you. So that's not something that's taken lightly. So people knowing that and seeing that and understand that's part of the culture, Jesus is saying you need to carry one of those every single day, deny yourself in order to follow me, or you can't be my disciple. That's crazy. And I wonder how our church, as the body of Christ, trains our people and teaches our people or creates a community that God has commanded us to create to move us into that direction. But I'm going to tell you right now that you can't get there without the gospel. You can't get there without the transformative part of the gospel. You can't get there unless you give up your right to try to get there, whether you want to get there or not. That's what the gospel is going to teach us. It's going to teach us today. All right. But it's funny, as I think about that, something that people always say is this: hey, no one's perfect, right? You heard that before. No one's perfect, right? We always say stuff like, why is it that we do all these things? Yeah, but you're flawed, I'm flawed, we're all flawed, And I hear arguments like that. I understand what people are saying, but at the same time, it's kind of weird because even though we're flawed, we want perfection. Even though we're messed up, we want something that's good. And we want it to be that way, even though we know deep down inside that we're messed up. But at the same time, we want something that's not messed up. How do I know that? Wait till you get engaged and you're planning your wedding. Your fiancé is going to want it to be perfect. Okay? Not you, the guy, because I know I'm not perfect, and I know it's not going to come out perfect, but your future wife's going to want that wedding to be perfect. Okay? And all your pictures need to reflect that too, Don't you dare not smile in those pictures, right? But at the same time, you know that it can't be. I mean, think about how people who enforce laws, right? Because we have laws in our society, right? But even those people who enforce laws are imperfect themselves, right? People who enforce laws also break laws. For example, police officers. And I'm glad they're not here today, because I can talk about them. Do police officers ever break the law? Sure they do. How many times have you seen police officers talk on the cell phone while they're driving? I see it all the time. I want to pull them over and go, hey, put that away, right? Citizens arrest, citizen shot. You got to be careful. Or judges or lawyers. You never hear about judges or lawyers sinning, right? Or presidents or things like that, right? Who enforce laws or judge laws or create laws or whatever. They practice laws and use laws to protect or prosecute people, but at the same time, they break the law themselves. But you can't use that whole we're not perfect excuse when it comes to things like that, because how many guys got pulled over by cops before? Yeah, I've been pulled over like 5 times. I only got 2 tickets because I used my charm to get out of them, right? But there's times I've gotten pulled over, but you can never say to the cop, what, you perfect? Like, you never sped before? You can't give me a speeding ticket. You're not perfect too. I mean, you can't use that argument with them, right? You can't. Or you're going to be on YouTube, like some of the people that I've seen lately, right? It just doesn't work that way. Because even though we're imperfect people, and we know that other people are imperfect, that guy's holding a gun and you're not, right? They're supposed to enforce the laws and you're not. That's the way that we live. I think that's the way people get so upset at police officers, like what's going on in our world in Ferguson right now, because the law did something supposedly wrong. Okay, I mean, I don't know what's going on exactly, but something that's wrong because you expect police officers to act a certain way, and when they don't and they abuse their authority, people get upset. What do? They send back. Now they're looting, right? It's kind of this weird thing. So we want something moral to come out of it, but we're going to immorally want something moral. And I think it just confuses the heck out of me. And then I look at the comments that people write in internet articles and things like that. Every person gets on their high horse and has a solution to everything, right? All you have to do is do these things and everything's good. And then someone else comments on how dumb that is. And there's like 1,236 comments, and I start reading all of them, and it's this exchange of all we got to do is this, and all we got to do is that, and it's imperfect people trying to make a perfect situation in this world. Yet deep down inside, we can't. Because in our world, we have to accept the fact that we as imperfect people, we can't create righteousness even though we want it. We can't create a perfect world even though we want it. Right? We accept the fact that there's sin and messed up things in the world. There's neighborhoods that we don't want to live in, right? But we look for a more perfect neighborhood, don't we? Because we're somehow hardwired like that. But the thing is, in our world, doing that is all about control, and it's all about power. Because how else can imperfect people use other imperfect people to create something perfect, or what they think is perfect, which is really imperfect? You have to wield power over them in order to do so. But the Bible, I think, teaches us that without God and the transformative power of the gospel, this is the only world that we'll ever have. This is it. But at the same time, you've heard people constantly say, there must be more than this. There must be something better than this. I don't know anybody, whether you're a believer or not, that go to a funeral and that person has passed away, that person has died. I don't think anybody says, man, they're in a worse place than this. Everybody says they've gone to a better place than this world, whether you're a believer or not. Why? Because we're hardwired like that. See, as Christians, Romans teaches us, the book that we're going to look at, that this is precisely what we can't do. We can't find perfection in and of ourselves. We can't obey the law in and of ourselves. Chapter 2 has made it clear from last week that creation teaches us that there is a God, right? You look at creation, you look at the beauty of creation, and you know that there's got to be some type of intelligent being out there, right? And everybody does it. It's kind of funny. It's like you watch National Geographic or something like that. Remember those shows where you have those people with the spears and things like that? hopping up and down. And they have those big earrings. You know, the typical things that you see in Indiana Jones movies and things like that. You see that, but at the same time, they all worship something, don't they? They have this concept of a higher being out in the middle of the jungle somewhere. They create some type of stone idol or something, right? Why? Because creation tells you that there is some type of intelligent being out there, but creation doesn't always tell you that that's God. Because they don't know that yet. But as Christians, we do. But at the same time, it's frustrating because creation can't get me to God. Neither can the law. Because the law teaches us that God's character is in the law, right? It's in his commandments. But at the same time, I can't obey them perfectly to get there. Even though we delight in it. And these Old Testament writers, they delight in the law of the Lord. King David, listens to the law. He holds the law in his hand at night. He can't sleep because he's, delighting in it. It's crazy. But at the same time, he can't get there. He just delights in who God is. The law cannot save us. We can't access God through creation. We can't access him through the law. We can't access him through our good works. The law simply tells us that there's a God and we know something about him. Creation tells us that there's a higher being out there, but we can't attain to him in and of ourselves. But what's happened in chapter 2 tells us that is we've usurped the role of the Creator. We become God ourselves. We've decided to push God aside and define things on our own. God says marriage is this. We say marriage is that, right? We take the role of the Creator and we create what's right or wrong. But like I said for the last 10 minutes or so, we're imperfect people. We can't create perfection, even though we desire it. Right? So this is what's illustrated in our passage today. And it comes from Romans chapter 2, starting from verse 17. And Paul has a spirited conversation with this imaginary person, as if he's talking to somebody and he's answering their objections. And it starts with being a Jew. Right? Jewish people, they're the people of God. And he says this, now you, verse 17, if you call yourself a Jew, right? And he's going at their identity. How in the world did you form your identities? Because I know that you form your identities this way. Which way is that? If you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? So as Jewish people, your identity is in the law. Your identity is in obeying the law. You delight in the law, all the things that you have to do, right? And you teach it to other people. You should, because that's what you're supposed to do. But at the same time, do you teach yourself the very things that you teach other people? Or what he's saying is, do you practice what you preach? You then teach people that they should not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? And this is where Paul really hits it home. He says this, as it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. God's name is jacked up because of the things that you've done. Right? You teach people the law, but you don't obey it yourself. You know, supposedly Mahatma Gandhi said this, and every time I hear this quote, it cuts to my heart. He said, I can't be a Christian because of Christians. Have you heard that before? I can't be the very thing that they say that they are because they don't obey it themselves. And that's a problem. And I think that if that's true, then we've projected Christianity incorrectly, because that's not it. And that's what he says. And then he goes on and he gives a specific example, because something that Jewish people are big on is circumcision. Okay? And if you don't know what circumcision is, when you have boys, it's excruciating. I mean, they don't let me go and watch our kids get circumcised, but I see the expressions on their face when they come back. And it's a painful thing. I always pray for my children. That's why I wanted 2 girls, because you don't have that problem, right? When you have 2 boys, it's time for circumcision, and they take them away. And I'm just like, oh my gosh. And it's a scary thing. If you don't know what that is, don't talk to me, okay? I don't want to explain that to you. But he says this, circumcision has value if you observe the law. Yeah, it's a good thing if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you have not been circumcised. So this whole circumcision thing was to teach other people that we are God's people, right? And that's good if you obey the law, but you can't always obey the law. And once you've broken the law, then this whole circumcision thing, it doesn't really matter anymore. Because, wow, you went through a really painful physical process, and it doesn't really matter. Isn't that crazy? And then verse 26, it says, so then if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? So these people aren't even circumcised, but they're doing other parts of the law, and they're keeping them. Well, then shouldn't they be kind of circumcised too? So you can't just pick and choose what you want in terms of God's law and say that I am that because of that, right? I call those people buffet Christians, right? Buffet Christians are people, they look at the Bible, I like this part, so I like that, I'll keep that. Another parts I don't, right? Either you keep all of the law or you don't keep the law. It's an all or nothing thing. You either get 100% or you get a 0. There's nothing in between. There is no 50%. There is no 80%. There is no 99%. It's either all or nothing. Or as Tom Cruise says, there's no points for second place, right? You just can't get past that. And he says this, verse 27, the one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. Right? And then he says this, and this harkens back to what he said earlier when he said, hey, you're Jewish, right? You are a Jew because you obey the law. And verse 20 says, a person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly. You don't get to come up with your own identity based on what you do on the outside, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart. By the Spirit, not by the written code, such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. He's saying you don't become a Jew based on what you do. You become a Jew because of who you are on the inside. Right? Now think about that. When I was a youth pastor a long time ago, one of the things that really frustrated me was I had a bunch of Asian kids that thought they were African American, right? I thought that was so interesting. And I saw a bunch of kids that when they played basketball, they were like, 4'3", 4'4", but they wore Kobe jerseys and stuff like that. And they would play basketball and try to do all these things. They would try to dunk and stuff like that. It's wishful thinking, and it's very imaginative. I think it's very interesting. But they just can't do it, right? They think by putting a Kobe jersey on that somehow you've turned African, and they start to talk that way, right? And one thing I want to do sometimes, I want to grab them and I want to put them in front of a mirror and go, you're Asian. You are Asian. Because I came from the generation where we weren't proud to be Korean because we were only like 1 or 2 Koreans in the whole school and everybody was white. Everybody wanted to be white. And the generation after us all of a sudden wanted to be Korean, and they would listen to K-pop and all that kind of stuff, even though they didn't know what was going on and they didn't understand it. But they found an identity in that too, right? It looks funny when you try to act like something or someone that you're not. And I think that's what Paul's trying to point out. You can't imitate something. You can't do it on your own. It comes from the inside, right? And Paul's point is really interesting because he points to their concept of identity. Your identity is found in the law that you need to do all these things, but at the same time, you really can't do it. So who are you really? Now, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law of God. He didn't say when. He says if. And Paul questions how someone can have an identity that comes from a reliance on yourself, yet they cannot find an identity in the law. Even though in the law itself there are beneficial aspects of the law such as circumcision. Circumcision is a good thing, and they tell you medically it's a good thing. These things only have value when the law is obeyed fully without fault. It's all or nothing. And Paul goes on to say that a person is only a person, a Jew is only a Jew if you are only one outwardly. Not one outwardly, but only inwardly. Their identity as Jews cannot save them through the observance of the law, right? Even their identity comes through God, their creator, and that's what Paul is trying to say. There isn't much of an advantage if you're the Jew, even though you have the law, unless you obey it 100%. Now think about that. It goes into the way that we form our identities, right? We've been told when we were young, it's all about who you are. Even my parents, when I first met Sarah, what's the first question my mom asked me? What do you think it was? Is she Korean? Yeah, she knew that I would marry a Korean. Yeah, she knew I would marry a Korean. Or Asian. I actually wanted to marry Japanese. And then I came to my senses, I think. And I ended up marrying Korean. I thought Japanese girls were really cute. I don't anymore. That's not what they asked. What's the first thing that they ask you? What does she what? What does she do? Right? What does she do? And I said, she's a teacher. And if she couldn't say, oh my gosh, you don't marry a teacher. Why? Because I was a teacher. So she can't say that. Right? She's a teacher. Oh, that's good. What do the parents do? That's the next thing, right? What do the parents do? They're pastors. They're the pastor. What are you going to say wrong about that? Don't marry a pastor? I'm also a pastor. So it was like a win-win situation. You know, I had to. There was no choice. And that's what we're taught. They don't ask about the character. They don't ask about all those things. They ask, what do they do? So it tells you about their identity. And the next thing they ask you is, what's their blood type? That's the next thing. So they ask you that too. And I was like, you're a pastor. You're a Christian. You're asking me for my blood type. I'm type A, right? And she's like, that's no good. That's not. I was like, what are you talking about? That doesn't mean ass. There's no such thing as F blood, but it's okay. All right? But think about that. Our identities are formed based on what we do. Now, we kind of laugh at that, but at the same time, I get concerned when I see it at church. And I've seen it at church before. I saw it in children's ministries. Now, in children's ministries, it's one of those things that piss me off more than anything. I mean, everything pisses me off, but that really, really, really pisses me off. Why? Because when you're in a church, right, the health of a church, people think the health of a church is based on food or the pastor. I don't care about those things as much as I care about the education that the children are receiving within the church. Because Jesus says, you mess around with the kids, you're messing around with me. So don't do it. So I look at that. So a lot of times I look at the materials that they're using, I look at the teachers, are they consistent, all that kind of stuff. That to me is really important. So when I look for a church, first thing I do is go to the children's ministry, right? And I look at what they're doing. It's really important. So I was at this church and I was looking at some of the classrooms that I wanted to go in. I had delusions of grandeur, thinking that I was all that. So I went into these classrooms and looking at what they were doing. So I looked at their work that they were doing, and they had some pictures up on the wall. I was like, cool, and they were cool pictures. And I saw some crucifixion pictures and all that kind of stuff. And if I saw that at school, I would refer them to the school psychologist, because that's kind of a weird thing for kids to draw. But they had that, and on the top of the paper, this is what the kids wrote: I need to work harder to be holy. And then my jaw dropped. I need to work harder to be holy. I was like, how does a human being work harder to be holy? How does a human being work hard to be like God? Now, I don't know the full context, and I need to be fair about that, but they better have taught that the only way you could even attempt to do that is based on what God has done, and it's not based on you. Because if it is, you're going to frustrate kids. You're telling a kid, you have to work harder to be perfect, even though they're imperfect. And you're going to frustrate them. You're going to tire them out. And you wonder why, like, kids, when they reach middle school and high school, they don't want to go to church anymore. When they go to college, they definitely don't want to go to church anymore. Why? Because they've had to work so hard to be holy all the time, and they're darn tired. Right? Even though the scripture is very clear, it's not your work that makes you holy. God's holy. He transforms you into someone that's holy. Now you can do some good works. And that really concerned me. I was like, what's going on? And I'm glad my son isn't old enough to be in these classes. Because I would have had words. But God said, don't. You don't speak Korean. And I was like, thank you that I don't. Sometimes it's a good thing, right? But our righteousness doesn't come from our works. We don't get to be a good person because of things that we do. I was having a conversation with a high school kid. And I'm not allowed to talk about religion, but if they bring it up, I can talk about it. Okay? So I do something so that they'll bring it up, and then I talk about it. That's right. I got skills, right? So the kids talk about God, and she said, I don't like the Bible. I don't believe in the Bible, but I believe in God. But I was like, well, how do you know that your God is God? Oh, no. Okay, but let's go with it. He's why is it that you don't like the Bible? Because the Bible says it's wrong to be like this and be like that. And I was like, okay. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, because John Lennon was a good person. I was like, of all the people in history, you have to choose John Lennon? Because she's a Beatlemaniac, right? He said, John Lennon was a good person. I was like, he cheated on his wife and ran off with another woman. What are you talking about? But for her, because he sings well, because Lucy's in the sky with diamonds or whatever, that he is a good person, right? Did he write that? Yeah, he wrote that. But it's actually LSD. Anyway. It's hard to get that out of people, that somehow your good works make you good. But deep down inside, you know that that's not true, right? So even the good are imperfect. So check out this quote from Pascal. Okay, it's some dude named Pascal. He said there are only two kinds of men. But I'll do it for our audiences today. There are only two kinds of people, okay? The righteous who believe themselves sinners, and the rest sinners who believe themselves righteous. One becomes righteous by acknowledging that you're a sinner and you can't be righteous, That's the first part of what he talked about. And there's other people who are sinners, but they think that they're righteous, right? It's kind of like the people that you meet. I know a lot of people who are kind of big like I am, but they think that they're skinny in their minds, and they dress like it, right? And you know what I'm talking about. It doesn't look right. But somehow in their minds, they feel like because my mind says that I'm skinny, I'm going to dress like I'm skinny, even though you're not. No offense. I'm not skinny. But I don't dress like I am either, okay? But that's the thing. And Paul spends a lot of time doing that. But then he goes on. He's in parts of chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. I don't have a lot of time to go through that. But he answers potential objections to how God's righteousness somehow came about because of our own. And he's talking to these people who say something like this. Look, we're unrighteous. Because we're unrighteous, then we find out that God is righteous. So we found out something good because of something wrong that we've done. So therefore, don't judge us for being unrighteous because righteousness came from our unrighteousness, right? Paul's like, what the heck are you talking about? What are you smoking? You can't use that argument, okay? He's saying there's no one righteous, and that's where we pick up in verse 9. What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Talking about Jewish people. Not at all. For we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin, as it is written. And look at the way that if you're going to insult somebody and put them down, you got to do it this way. Okay? Because it's really nice. It's kind of like British people who like insult you. It's like, wow, that sounds so cool. So here it is. There is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. That's pretty damning, isn't it? Right? There's no one righteous, not even one. This is who we really are without God. And then verse 19 says, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. He's saying this. The purpose of the law was never, ever to give you righteousness. Ever. The purpose of the law was to tell you that there's something wrong, that there's sin in your life. It's kind of like this. Let's say you have brain damage. I don't like brain damage for some reason. Let's say you have brain damage. And then you do an MRI, right? So you go to the hospital, you do an MRI. I think it's an MRI. It's an MRI, right, for brain damage? Okay. I was going to say X-ray, but I don't think that's right. But an MRI for brain damage, right? And the MRI is going to tell you if you have brain damage or not, right? But the MRI doesn't heal you. It doesn't heal you. You may think that it does, but it doesn't heal you, right? You just get scanned. It tells you that there's something wrong. Now, when it tells you that there's something wrong, I got MRIs done and CAT scans done because I'm kind of a hypochondriac, right? So I just want to make sure because, there might be something wrong. And I often think that I have brain damage, and that's why I go, right? But after having the scan and looking at the X-ray, or not the X-ray, the MRI, I don't look at the MRI and go, oh, now I know what's wrong with me. I'm going to go fix myself. Right? I don't go Google how to fix brain damage, self-help. You don't do that. No one ever does that. If you do, you have brain damage, so it should tell you something, right? It should. But no one ever does that. Why? Because the purpose of the MRI is just to tell you what's wrong with you, and that's it. That's the purpose of it. I don't go to the MRI and go, oh, man, I bow down to the MRI because you have saved me. No. It just tells me that something's wrong. That's what the law is, right? It's kind of like this. We were coming home from a youth group retreat one time, and I was on the bus, and everybody just started laughing at me, which is very commonplace, but I want to know why they were laughing at me at this particular time. And they just kept like, they were pointing, and they were laughing, and I was like, what the heck? So I went to a trusted teacher, and I looked at her, and she started laughing at me too. I was like, man, when teachers are laughing at me with the people, I was like, what's wrong? And they wouldn't tell me what's wrong the whole time. They just kept laughing. 2 hours of coming down from the mountain, throwing up, and I'm getting laughed at for whatever reason. And then the teacher looks at me, and she starts laughing, and she hands me a mirror. I was like, what's wrong? There's nothing wrong. I don't know what's wrong. And I look, and there's a booger hanging out of my nose the whole time, and they wouldn't tell me. Hate high school kids. But the only way that I would have known what was wrong with me was what? The mirror. So when someone's just laughing at you, you don't know you think something's wrong with you. And I was like, I'm sitting down so my zipper's not undone. So they're not laughing at me because of that. But the mirror will tell you exactly what's wrong with you, right? That's the purpose of the law. The law was just to tell you that you can't do something, so why is it that we try to do it? That's the whole point of what Paul's saying. He's like, you can't reach God through creation. Creation that tells you there's a God, there's a higher power out there, but I can't get to it. All I can do is admire it. I know that there's a higher power out there. I don't know how to get there. And then the law comes, and I think, oh, the higher power is out there, so if I just obey the law, then I can get there. But what you're really saying is this. God is perfect. Everyone knows that. And no one thinks that God's a sinner just like you are. Okay? You non-believers really don't think that. But what you're saying is I can be perfect through just imitating God. Isn't that crazy? Right? I can be perfect by imitating God. Or another way is this. We know that God is infinite, right? We're finite. And somehow, being finite, I can be infinite if I work hard to do something. If I do some things to get there. And we mistake the law as a way to get to God. We do that in our churches too. You need to do these things to become a Christian. You need to do that to become a Christian. And we tire people out. And people don't want to come to church anymore. Why? So we do more programs and all that kind of stuff to get you there. But I don't think that's what the primary thing is. I think people are tired of being constantly told that you need to do something to be something or someone when you're already someone already based on what God has done. Christians and believers find their identity in the gospel. Christians are people who have given up and said, I put my hands up, I give up. I can't define myself. I need you to do that. And we get slammed for that. You guys are a bunch of wussies. You just use Christianity as a clutch. I mean, not a clutch, a crutch. And I don't even know what that means. And I'll go, of course I do, because I'm broken. I'm broken. Man, you Christians, you guys are so weak. That's why you need somebody that has more strength. I was like, yeah, I am weak. That's why I became a Christian. I can't do it on my own. So these insults that I thought were very insulting were really, really just descriptions of where I really am. Right? So when churches say, come just as you are, which is a really good altar call song too. Come just as you are. That's what we're saying. You're broken? This is the place to go. I never go in the hospital and go, man, I'm really healthy. Can I see a doctor today? Never. Well, actually, they'll probably think that you need to see a doctor because you said something like that, so you could look at it that way. But you don't. This is a place where we're broken. This is a place that we're messed up, and we've come because we're tired of trying on our own. And then we get to verse 21, and check this out. It's the but now. Sometimes buts aren't very good. Okay, what I mean by that? Like someone talks to you something, we want to do this, we want to do this, but, and then you're like, oh, so that's really, really what it is, right? But that's not what Paul does here. Because from chapter 2, verse 1, all the way up to chapter 3, verse 20, Paul's been slamming people pretty hard. And I was saying, I really appreciated Pastor Sam's message last week, but I think he was being really nice with chapter 2. I thought chapter 2 was much more than that. But then he's a very positive guy. So he sees things, and I'm a very negative person, so that's why I see a lot more, and that might be why. But I see it as more than it is. But then the positive turn comes right here. Even though we're like this, even though we've done this, even though we usurp the role of the Creator, even though we try to be God on our own, even though we try to find righteousness on our own, but now it's different. And what is that difference? Verses 21 through 26. Martin Luther, if you know who that is. Again, I have to say this because someone always comes. Not Martin Luther King. Okay? Martin Luther. If you don't know the difference, don't talk to me. But just Martin Luther. He said this. He said, these are the central verses of all of Scripture. I was like, dang. Right? So if you want a Cliff Notes version of the Bible, these verses are it. These sum up everything. That's so awesome, right? So here it is. But now, okay, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. Again, he's placing his audience in the context of salvation history. Right? This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. This points back to chapter 1, verse 16, 17, where it says, the righteous shall live by faith. Right? Not on your own works, but based on faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There's no difference between Jew and Gentile. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. He's saying, now the solution is here. You know that you tried and you're tired and you try to be righteous and you can't because if you break one part of the law, you've broken all of the law. You think you're circumcised, you think you're all that, but if you're circumcised and go through that painful process and mess up once, you mess up the whole law. So you can't even define yourself properly, right? You think creation will tell you that there's a God, and it does, but you know what? You can't reach him on his own. And then the law came, and you think by trying to obey the law that you can reach God or be someone, and you know what? You can't. Because it's an all or nothing thing. But now there's a righteousness that comes apart from your own good works. And it comes from what God has done. And God's saying, I'm going to give you righteousness even though you don't deserve it. And I'm going to solve the problem that you have created by sinning and messing up. Whereas before we thought we messed up and we can clean up our own mess, we've come to an idea and an epiphany that, you know what, I screwed up and I can't clean my own mess. And someone else needs to clean it up for me. And God says, I will clean that mess because you can't, and I will do it through Jesus. And if you believe in my solution to the problem and not your solution to the problem, that's where righteousness is. The church is not for the perfect. The church is for the imperfect. Even though deep down you desire perfection. And you want that, and that perfection is in Christ. When God says, be holy for I'm holy, be perfect for I'm perfect, there's comfort in that because in your heart of hearts, in your desire, in who you are as a person, you desire that perfection. And you also know in the heart of hearts, you can't get there on your own. That's the message of the gospel. That's your identity as a believer. That's our identity as a church. And the solution is always Jesus. I know, it sounds cliche, right? Remember you're a youth group kid and your youth group teachers would always ask you questions and you always just said Jesus, and it was always the right answer? Right? To some extent, it is the right answer, right? The body of Christ, the church, revolves around the righteousness that comes from the work of Jesus Christ and the gospel. That has to be the center of our church. It's not optional. The church is a place of broken people who can only be made whole through the work of Jesus on the cross, and that's why you're here. You know, as a pastor, I struggle with the fact that, you know, people have certain ideas of what pastors and who pastors should be, right? And what cars they drive, and I'll explain that in just a second. You know, pastors, you have to be able to speak well. You have to be eloquent. You have to use certain types of vocabulary. You can't wear flip-flops. You can't do this, you can't do that. You have to have charisma. That's my favorite one. And look, I have none of those things. So what am I doing here? Why? Because I've come to realize that all I have is the gospel. And that's okay. All I have is the grace of God. And that's okay, because that's what's transformed me, and that's what transforms you. It's not my own qualifications always, right? It's what God has done. And why do I say that? It's because I heard the story of a pastor, and this story really pissed me off. How many times have I said that just during the sermon alone? I'm a very angry person. See, that's another reason I probably shouldn't be doing this, right? But I heard this story about a pastor who, you know, lives a relatively humble life. Doesn't live in a huge house or anything like that. You know, lives in a townhouse just like I do. And He got into a car accident. He got sideswiped. So he was in his Toyota Camry, because pastors only can drive Accords and Camrys. And he got slammed pretty hard, and it just totaled the car. So he went out and bought a new car. He's like, you know what? This time I'm going to get something that I really want for myself. I understand that. Everybody has a dream car that you want, right? So his dream car was a Hyundai Genesis. Obviously, he didn't dream very much. But that was his dream, to get a Hyundai Genesis. And because they say, you know, the Hyundai is the new Honda. And if you use imagination, it is. And he bought this car, and it made him happy. His wife even saw that he was happy driving this sports car, Hyundai Genesis. But then one day, he was at church, and a deacon came up to him, a deacon that this pastor really respected. He said, I got to talk to you about something, because there's talk going around the church that they're being stumbled by you. So what did I do? He's all, you drive a Hyundai Genesis. I was like, so what do you mean? He's all, you're driving a sports car. And then the deacon said, I'm even stumbled by the fact that you're driving a sports car. Because a pastor, we can't imagine a pastor after serving and preaching going outside and going into a sports car. Pastors don't get into sports cars. Of all the things that you can be stumbled by, that's what you're going to be stumbled by. There's children starving in the streets. There's homeless people that have no homes. There's civil unrest. Of all the things that are going to hit you spiritually, it's the fact that your pastor drives a sports car. Now, he was very upset by that, obviously, right? Because it's not like he lives lavishly. It was just one thing that he really wanted. But he's in a situation because they were in a church plant just like ours, and they haven't been around for that much. And it made him really angry because the people in this congregation are very, very wealthy. They live in mansions and stuff like that. But they can be rich, but the pastor can't drive a sports car because it's somehow biblical. I haven't found that verse yet. I did a search with my computer, and the computer, I don't know, just wouldn't find it. I don't know why, but that's what it was. So he was in that situation, and it made him very upset. So what did he do? He took the car that he basically only had 500 miles, so he took it to another dealership and tried to sell it so he can buy a Accord or a Camry, or whatever car the congregation allows him to have, apparently, and losing money in order to do that. And I respect him for doing that in the sense that he's willing to sacrifice. I don't think it's much of a sacrifice to get rid of a Hyundai Genesis, but for him it is to get a Hyundai Sonata, I don't know, or whatever the case it is. But that's what made him angry. But on top of that, he was having problems with his wife. And I just want to let you know on a little secret, just between you and me. Pastors have problems with their wives. Just between you and me. Okay? And he did. And they were fighting a lot. And this whole sports car thing didn't help the situation. It got to a point where he wrote a resignation letter, and he held it in his pocket for weeks and weeks, and he was going to just hand it in church at one time. And the reason being is this. He said, I can't preach the gospel to people, and I can't teach people about love if I have trouble loving my own wife. And a lot of people say, that's right, practice what you preach. Get out of there. And when you get out of there, you should be driving a four-wheeled, four-door car and not the sports car. Get out. But then I was listening to the story, and I was talking to Sarah about it. I was like, man, there's a story and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, but that pastor, he should be the one speaking the gospel. He's wrong. He should be the one preaching the gospel. Because it's out of God's grace that he can come up before the pulpit and even admit to people and admit to himself that, man, I don't know if I can really do that and love my wife in the same. I'm not saying it's okay to be hypocritical. I'm not saying it's okay to not practice what you preach. And he knows that. But that he can come humbly before the pulpit and say, you know what? I am a sinner in need of Jesus. I'm going to talk about that with you. You're the very person to do that. And then I was like, man, he should have kept that sports car. Forget that. And then Sarah said, but it was a Hyundai Genesis. I was like, get rid of it. It is not our works. It is not that. And even as a pastor, I talk about my weaknesses from the pulpit because I'm a sinner in need of Jesus too. I'm not up here because I'm better than you, smarter than you, speak better than you. I don't think that's the case. I've spoken to a lot of you guys. You guys probably should be preaching, and I should be down there. In fact, if you want to do that now, come on up. But I'm up here because of God's grace. And that's all I can preach. And I can just preach the gospel because I'm a recipient of the gospel too. Okay? Not only am I the president of the Hair Club, I'm also a client of the Hair Club. First service didn't get that. You guys did, so there you go. I didn't even tell it to first service, but that's what it is. It's the gospel that governs us every single day. You wake up in the morning, you preach the gospel to yourself because that's what defines you every single day. You know, the other Pastor Sam, I call him Golfer Sam. This Sam, I call him Jogger Sam. There's two Sams. There's Jogger Sam and Golfer. But Golfer Sam came up and did a sermon on the gospel, and he taught this. And it was a quote that I wanted to use, but he took it. It was from Tim Keller. He said, the gospel is not the ABCs of Christianity. It's the A through Z of Christianity. What he meant by this is this. The gospel is not just an entrance into Christianity. The gospel is what sustains you every single day as you live as a Christian. It is Christianity. So you wake up in the morning and you preach the gospel to yourself. I was like, man, you don't need to go out and prove to anyone who you are. God's already given you a certain status. God's given you an identity. Based on identity, go live and be who you are. That's what it's saying. It's freeing, isn't it? It absolutely is. It's grace that propels you. It's grace that is the power that transforms you, that you're able to live the life that you've always wanted to live, right? Now think about this. You know how many people I've spoken to who've gone out on missions and things like that, and I've spoken to some of our missionaries too, who've gone to other countries, and some of them say this, you know, we go to other countries and we serve and we see God working, it's so obvious, and we look back at America and we say, we hate America. And I was like, don't say that in customs when you're coming back. Don't do that. They will shoot you. Okay, they will shoot you. But I understand why they say that to some extent, because they've gone from a familiar place to something out there, and somehow by being out there and by serving God, they've discovered that this is who they really are. And when you've discovered who you really are, it's freeing. Because maybe for the first time or second time in your life, you've been in a place where, through the gospel, you've been transformed, and you're doing what God has asked you to do, and you're being like Him, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is who I am. And I couldn't have seen it here, but I was able to see it here for some reason. And it's freeing. I don't know how many people that I've heard say things like that. I'm at home, I need to keep up with the Joneses, I need to do this, I need to buy a car, I need to get that house, I need to get that education, all that kind of stuff. I know it's cliche, but at the same time, those are sometimes the very things that keeps us from knowing who we really are. So when you remove yourself from that situation and you go, man, this is who I am, and I feel alive. And I've heard so many people say, the only time that I've ever felt alive in my life was when I was out in the mission field. I'm not saying you have to do that, but for that person, the manifestation of who they are in Christ was through missions. But imagine at our church if we take these words seriously. And we come to a conclusion that we can't make a name for ourselves. That we need the righteousness that comes from God, that the righteous only live by faith, that we could have that type of experience here in Anaheim. Where even though the happiest place on earth is on Harbor Boulevard, there's another place where we're happy because we know who we are in Christ. I have to use this every day when I feel down about myself. I have to use this every day when I bomb a lesson at work. I have to use this every day when I wasn't so nice to my wife. I have to use the gospel every day when I failed in some way. I have to use the gospel every single day when I don't have a proper self-image of myself. Because I can't get out of it. I can't be a better husband without the gospel. I can't give of myself without the gospel. I can't minister to others without the gospel. And there's times when I'm at work, these kids I don't want to teach. They're rude, they're disrespectful. They don't deserve my knowledge. That's what I think. But I encourage them constantly. Good job. I like how you did that. You know what 8 times 5 is. And you might think, well, it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. Many times it is. Why? Because I'm faking it? I can't fake it. I'm one of those people, when I'm mad, you know I'm mad. I can't fake it. But the only way that I can do that is if I preach the gospel to myself and I say to myself, man, you were an enemy of God. You were a sinner. And yet God looked upon you with love and He sent His Son to die for you, even though you don't deserve it. And He encourages you every single day, even though you don't deserve it. And you get transformed by that, and you want to do that to other people. But the power doesn't come from you. It comes from the transformative power of the gospel. And that's what Paul's talking about. All right? Let's come before the Lord in prayer. I want to challenge those of you who think that you're all that, respectfully, based on the works of your own hands, that you've created some type of identity in and of yourself, that you become the creator in your own life by deciding what is wrong, right and wrong for yourself. But at the same time, there's a small part of you who knows that you can't sustain that. You're tired of trying to define who you are. And most of those definitions of who you are based on other people's definitions of who they think you are. And you just want to come to the truth because there's a part of you that tells you that you can't be perfect, yet you desire perfection. And I'm here to tell you today that the only perfection that you're going to get is through Jesus Christ and the work that he did on the cross. And the holiness and the perfection that only comes from gazing your eyes at the Father and the work that he's done and not the work that you've done. And there's no sense of shame. It's a sense of awakening for you. You've just gone through an MRI telling you this is what's going on. And the solution is right here in Christ. As cliche as it is, it's right here for you. And here's a time to accept that solution for your life. You've come to the right place. For those of you who become Christians for a long time and been Christians for a long time, maybe you've forgotten you've forgotten your first love, what it was like to come into the presence of God for the first time and be inundated with the love of God. And that's what drove you to live a life of freedom. And maybe you've forgotten that. And maybe you've gone under the yoke of slavery once again, and today was a reminder that you're free. And if that's the case, then realign yourself to God based on what he's done for you. Wherever you are in your life, make that your prayer right now.